Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome from Florence to all of you around Europe and around the world. And thank you for joining us for the Global Citizenship webinar on citizenship for the children of immigrants. How does it matter and to whom? I'm really excited today to be here with great panelists and to have an hour and a half time to discuss with you this important and I think, appreciated topic of the citizenship status of the children of immigrants. My name is Maarten Vink. I'm the chair in citizenship studies here at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies of the European University Institute, and I'm co-director of the Global Citizenship Observatory. So in today's webinar, which will last for an hour and a half, we discuss the role of citizenship in the lives of children of immigrants. Acquiring citizenship at birth is likely to exert an effect on children's human capital, maybe through a more secure future, or the parents' expectations on the return of to host country specific human capital investment. And growing up in a country with or without being formally recognized as a full member of society can, of course, also influence the way in which children associate themselves in the country where they grow up, be they the second generation born in the country or the 1.5 generation or subsequent generations. Now, recently there have been some studies that have identified the relevance of citizenship for immigrants and also their children, especially on educational outcomes. And we've included a couple of links in the program to recent studies. And of course, this is crucial, especially in Europe, where territorial birthright citizenship still remains the exception. If you look at the work that we have done here at the Global Cit Observatory, you will see that if we are talking about the second and the third generation, at best 25% of countries in Europe has some kind of direct access to citizenship at birth. So, but this is always conditional either upon the resident status of the parents or upon the birth place of the parent. And as a result, children largely are dependent for the citizenship status on the timing of their parents' naturalization. Now, today we have two great papers that really represent, I think, the state of the art in citizenship and migration studies on how citizenship status affects educational outcomes among the children of immigrants. And these two recent papers are based on the cases of Germany and the Netherlands, and we will discuss well, three things in particular. I think you will find that both of the authors will devote a bit of time to explain the empirical strategies they employ to identify causal effects of citizenship on educational outcomes, which of course is not straightforward. And there I think both papers represent two different ways to go about, and hopefully also these will inspire you for additional studies in other countries. Secondly, both of the authors will look especially on the timing of citizenship acquisition. Does it matter if you acquire this at birth or later for some of these educational outcomes? And we'll also talk about heterogeneous effects within the study population. So we have a splendid lineup of speakers to address these questions, and it's my pleasure to introduce these speakers to you briefly. First of all, we have Christina Gatman, who is the head of the labor market department at LISER, the Luxembourg Institute of Socio-Economic Research, and she will present her paper on the effects of birthright citizenship on children's school performance based on the German case. Secondly, we have Marie Labussière, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Amsterdam, and she will present her paper on the timing of citizenship acquisition and immigrants' children educational performance based on the case of the Netherlands. And finally, we have Thomas Sowell, Associate Professor and Canada Research Chair in International Migration from McGill University, who was willing to comment on these two papers, very much an expert on research on migration, especially the second generation. So thanks a lot also to Thomas for being here today and commenting. We had asked a second discussant, Elina Kielpi-Jaakkonen, who unfortunately had to inform us today that due to unforeseen circumstances, she cannot be there. So that's of course a pity that Elina cannot be there. Maybe the good thing is that this gives us more time for discussion and also for all of you in the audience to participate in the discussion. So the format is pretty straightforward. We have 2 presentations, maximum 20 minutes. Then we have 10 minutes comments by Thomas, and that should leave us a good half hour to discuss. You're very welcome to post any questions that you have in the chat. This can be during the presentation. So when something is unclear, please write this in the chat to everyone, and then the authors will see these questions, and I will also see them. And when we get to the discussion part of the seminar, I will ask both of the authors to respond to these questions in a couple of rounds. So please feel free to write up any questions that you have, or any thoughts or comments or broader reflections in the chat. Well, I think the setup is pretty straightforward. So thanks a lot again for both speakers, Marie and Christina, for presenting your work. And we agreed that Christina will kick off. So I give you the floor, Christina, and I think you should also have the right to share your screen. Exactly. So the floor is yours, Christina. Please unmute yourself.
I'm sorry. Yeah, so now I should be hearable. So thank you very much for the invitation. I should say this is joint work with several doctoral students who now started to proceed on to postdoctoral positions in other careers. And it's called Marginal Returns to Citizenship and Educational Performance. I think the motivation is pretty straightforward. Now I can't seem to move my slides. Okay, hang on. Somehow I can't. Okay, now. So I think the motivation, I guess, is pretty straightforward. If you just look at the sheer number of children that have some kind of family background, whether it's born in the country of destination, or whether it's foreign born with migration experience. And you see, you know, Luxembourg is really the extreme case of almost 70%, but the country I will be talking about is Germany, which has about 1/3, so 1 in 3 children that have some kind of migratory background. And we also know, and I guess that's also not new, that we have pretty strong immigration native gaps in educational achievement, whether that's high school graduation, whether that's test scores. If you look at the PISA results, you have pretty strong gaps. Now, the question is, what role can citizenship and citizenship policies play in potentially helping bringing immigrant children forward and giving them the same educational opportunities to proceed and prosper? So citizenship has been shown, I mean, it's the most important right a country can grant its immigrants. And we have evidence, I think pretty good evidence from adult immigrants, first generation immigrants, that it has positive impacts on their economic integration in terms of labor, employment, and earnings, but also in terms of their social integration with respect to family, marriage, and fertility. At least in economics, the effects of on children are less well established, or at least it has been not so trivial to establish good results. So we do have some evidence that birthright citizenship increases high school attendance. Beyond that, maybe the evidence is less clear. So I want to throw out 3 research questions. I will try and answer in the 20 minutes. So does a more liberal citizenship policy improve educational achievement? And we want to look at a broad set of indicators, test scores, grades, but also how you perform and proceed in the educational career. And then second and third, questions that haven't been really answered: who benefits from citizenship and which policy actually works best? And I think that's maybe also, I think from a policy discussion, maybe the most interesting one. So why do we even think that citizenship, and I will be talking about first and second generation immigrants, so young children and youth, but they can be either born in the country or migrated from abroad. And there are multiple channels why we think that citizenship could matter for the educational careers of these children. So the first one is, in principle, some of these children can naturalize because their parents can naturalize. So it's more of an indirect way to obtain citizenship. And we know that citizenship for the parents and for adults has positive impacts on their labor market assimilation and also in part on their human capital investment. And both of these could, of course, have an impact on the children, either via an income channel or through sort of the educational endowment that parents have, which could influence parenting styles and role models they perceive. So that's, I think, the first channel. The second channel is that we do have evidence that parents who get naturalized also change their family formation behavior. They seem to invest, marry later and have their first child later, which in most cases also means fewer children. And so there could be a quantity trade-off that you invest more heavily in the human capital of the child, but you might have fewer children. And then the third one, the third channel, which I think is also important, is you might also change the perception and the role model you create for these children. So if you offer them, especially I think that's true for birthright citizenship, sort of this idea that they're equal members of society, they're welcome as sort of the destination country citizen, I think that might also change the orientation. What is sort of the role model? What is the type of career or the type of values I cherish? And last but not least, it might also change how you're assessed by teachers and by your surroundings. And whether that's discrimination or not, I don't know, but it might affect how you're perceived. So all of these means that citizenship, whether it's directly through birthright or through parental naturalization, could have an effect on the educational performance of children. So what I want to talk about today is the German setting. And Germany has really come around from a country that basically didn't have any explicit criteria for naturalization before 1991 to a country that has a substantial use solely birthright citizenship right. And here in particular, there are two reforms that are crucial. The first one is the 1991 reform, which for the first time introduced criteria for naturalization. And what's relevant here for us is that from the perspective of the child, this reform in 1991 opened up two roads to become a German citizen, both through naturalization. Either the child or the youth could apply him or herself when they become age 16 after spending a certain amount in the country, or they can naturalize through their parents, because the parents can include the dependent children in the application for naturalization. There are a number of other requirements which I will not touch upon. If you want, we can get back to that in the discussion. The 2000 reform is important because it introduced really birthright citizenship in Germany. And hence, for all the immigrant children whose parents have been living in Germany on a legal basis, obviously, for 8 years, and if they're born 2000 or later, get automatic citizenship. And again, there are some other criteria. You shouldn't be a criminal and murder people and some other things. You have to show a decent amount of some German skill, but I will not touch upon that too much in the talk. Now, what these two reforms give us, you already see the thick eligibility. So there are basically three channels how you can become eligible for German citizenship, and this is what's shown in the table, and there are certain criteria attached to it. So we basically have this road to naturalization, either for the child themselves or the parents, or we have birthright citizenship, which basically gives the child citizenship at birth. Now, all of these eligibility channels depend on essentially 3 demographic characteristics, and that's going to be important for the empirical strategy. They depend on your birthplace, because if you're not born in Germany, you can't have birthright citizenship. They depend on your arrival year, because that determines whether you can naturalize at all and what residency requirements you face. And they depend on your age at arrival, because for some strange political reasons, the residency requirements vary widely across ages. So what we are going to do in this paper is to use these 3 channels through naturalization, individual and family eligibility, and birthright citizenship as instruments for actual take-up of citizenship. And we will then explore the correlation between who takes up citizenship and what the benefits of those that take or don't take up citizenship are in terms of educational performance. And to do that, we will use a framework that has been developed by Robert Moffat and Jim Heckman, the marginal treatment effects framework that really tries to tease out on the margin who benefits from citizenship, and you can play around and do lots of kinds of wonderful things. So just to give you some background, I don't, if you not inclined to any formula or math, just listen quietly, and I will. It will only be 2 slides just to give you an idea of what we're doing. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to model the take-up decision of citizenship. As I said, we're using basically an instrumental variable approach, but at a very small scale, let's say. And we're going to control for all of the demographics that also determine your eligibility. So to make sure that your age of arrival and your arrival year and your birthplace is not directly affecting your outcomes. We're also controlling for parental characteristics. And the first thing we want to understand is like how these observables determine your take-up decision. But then what's crucial is we want to know about your unobservable in this take-up decision. So what are sort of the factors, we call them unobserved costs, that inhibit or encourage you to take up citizenship. We're going to create a propensity score out of this first stage, and impose common support between treated and untreated children, which are children that have citizenship and those that don't. And then now that comes the crucial part. The first equation is crucial. So we're going to model the gain you have in educational outcomes, whether that's a test score, whether that's a grade in math, for example, as a function of observable characteristics. That's basically the axis. And some unobservable characteristics, which is related to your propensity to pick up citizenship in the first place. So what's crucial is that this first equation basically shows you is that the children that pick up citizenship, you would think that these are the children that maybe have the highest gains from citizenship, which we would call positive selection. So if I know I benefit enormously from citizenship, I should pick it up. But you could also have the opposite scenario where children that actually have high gains from citizenship don't pick it up because the parents never naturalize for some other reason, for example. And that's the type of thing we can actually pick up with our empirical approach. So what we are going to do is we're going to estimate basically a marginal treatment effect, which is the formula here at the bottom, which provides us with, at every point, at the propensity to pick up citizenship, which is basically a proxy, an empirical proxy for the unobserved cost to pick up citizenship. What is the gain for you to actually have citizenship? And then we can see whether that's true that people that have high costs of obtaining citizenship are the ones that gain the most, or if it's the one that have actually low costs. We have to make the typical IV assumptions for an instrumental variable approach. I won't bore you with that. I think we try to, in the paper, we try a lot of things to make sure that we think that a conditional independence and monotonicity assumptions are basically satisfied. Let me talk about the data and then walk you through the results. So basically what we have is the survey of National Educational Panel Survey, and we're pooling multiple cohorts together. We have the years 2010 and 2018. What's interesting about the survey in Germany, we don't have this fantastic administrative data as in Scandinavia, or I guess in the Netherlands. So we have to work with survey data. But what's great is that in the survey, we actually have information about the migration background of the parents, which is something which is not easy to get. And so we can actually implement our approach. And we have a large set of outcome variables. Most important, how do they perform in school? So do they repeat the grade? Are they actually make it to high school, or do they are reverted to the lower secondary education? We have their grades in German and math, and we have test scores. And so what's key here is we will look at both first and second generation immigrants. So children born in Germany, but also children who came as children 4 or 5 years old on average to Germany with their parents. Just to give you a sense of our sample, so we have a sample that has a large share that are actually German citizens. We see that the eligibility criteria, so about a third are eligible through birthright, a third about are eligible to apply for themselves. They're old enough to apply. And then we have the vast majority is eligible through their parents. And we do see, for example, in terms of the outcomes, that, for example, repeating a grade is a quite common phenomena in German schools among immigrant children. It's about 1 out of 7. So it's quite a phenomena that is quite common. And you see the grades, they go from 1 to 6. Lower is better. So they have like grades of 3, which is sort of okay-ish. It's maybe not great. In terms of the test scores, they're all normalized to have mean 0 and 1 in the common sample of German and immigrants. So you see that on average, they're slightly worse than the German sample. Okay, so let's walk through some results. So first we look at the take-up decision. So who's actually taking up citizenship? And the key message here is that all of our eligibility indicators have a strong positive impact on take-up. So, if our instruments wouldn't work well for the take-up decision, we would be in trouble. But what we see here across different samples and different controls, basically, if you go across the columns, it all seems to be working well, that being eligible for a certain type of channel of naturalization increases your likelihood of having German citizenship. Interestingly, something which we see, which I describe also in the paper, is that if you look at across immigrants from the country of origin, you see, for example, the Turkish immigrants are much less likely to naturalize, whereas immigrants from the former Soviet Union, Kazakhstan and Georgia and many other countries are actually more likely to pick up German citizenship than the default, the reference group, which is the rest of the world. So the second, which I think quite interesting result is if we look at now outcomes, the way to read this graph is basically we're looking at the x-axis at the unobserved cost of picking up treatment. So these are costs because, your parents don't think having a German passport is valuable. It's because you are afraid of giving up your old citizenship. Maybe you're not convinced you really want to become a German citizen. All kinds of costs or psychological barriers you can imagine why you maybe not be taking up citizenship. On the y-axis, you have the treatment effect. So what's your gain in terms of having a likelihood of repeating a grade? That is on the y-axis. So what do we see here? We see here that as you increase the cost, so the children that have a tendency to have high costs to picking up citizenship, they are also less likely to pick up citizenship. They are actually would gain the most from picking up citizenship because it reduces their likelihood of having to repeat a grade. So this is kind of interesting because it means that the people who actually get German citizenship are not necessarily the ones in terms of educational performance that seem to have the highest gains, which is something which is quite uncommon because you would think, well, if I have a huge gain, I should have a higher likelihood of also choosing that particular action. But this is not what we see. Now, we can play this game and use this marginal treatment effect framework to aggregate it up into conventional treatment effects. And here we basically look at different outcomes. And let's just focus on the ATT and the ATU, or maybe just the ATU in the sake of time. So this basically means what would be the gain in terms of the outcome, which is shown on the top, for those that haven't taken up treatment. So those that are actually not naturalized. And what you see here is that most of the positive outcomes, you are less likely to repeat a grade. You're more likely to be in high school rather than a lower secondary school. You have a better math grade. All of these benefits are mostly concentrated among those that actually didn't take the treatment, so are not yet citizens. Whereas you see modest, but typically not statistically significant effects among those that actually take up treatment. So what this means is that somehow these unobserved costs are holding people back picking up citizenship, and it would be desirable if you want to improve educational performance of immigrant children to think about how can we get these people actually to take up citizenship in the first place. And here is where I want to sort of show you what you can do with this kind of econometric framework. We can start to think about policy simulations, and that will be the last result, and then basically I'm done. So we can think about, okay, would it be worthwhile in the first place to increase take-up? And as I already said, because we seem to be having very large gains among the population of immigrant children that don't naturalize, what we did in this top row is just to say, well, if we could somehow magically increase take-up, would that be beneficial in terms of lowering the propensity to repeat a grade? And what you see is there are negative numbers, which means, yes, increasing take-up would be good because these children would benefit from that. Now, the second question is, well, how could we achieve this take-up, this higher take-up? Would it be better to loosen the requirements for naturalization, or would it be maybe easier or better to make birthright citizenship more accessible? So we looked at two types of reforms. The first one is we said, let's impose a US-style birthright citizenship, where we say we drop the requirement that parents have to live in Germany for 8 years. You just have to be born in the country. That's the type of reform we looked at. And for naturalization, we said, well, maybe these 8-year residency requirements is quite a lot. Let's go down to the US style and think about 5 years. And then we basically check, okay, if we loosen up the eligibility criteria, how is that affecting take-up? This is what you see in the last column. You basically see that you only increase take-up if you liberalize birthright citizenship. You don't really get much traction from liberalizing or reducing residency requirements for naturalization. So I think that's the first interesting result. And then the second interesting result is, well, if we did that, which children would pick up the citizenship, and what's the benefit for them potentially in lowering their likelihood of repeating a grade? And what you see here is that there are benefits of both reforms, but it looks like the benefit of birthright citizenship is higher. Not only in terms of getting more people into picking up citizenship, but also in terms of improving their educational performance. So this tells you that if anything, we should think about birthright citizenship as the more powerful, let's say, citizenship policy. And there is still a margin for improvement if we think about children's educational performance. So let me conclude and sorry, I couldn't really go into the details of the econometrics, but I can try and hopefully explain something if you have any questions. So what we find is that liberalizing citizenship does benefit minority children. We do find the biggest effect really on school performance for the children that are sort of more on the lower end of the school performing outcomes. So they're less likely to repeat a grade, they're more likely to attend high school and not other more vocational or training oriented schools. We do see some improvements in math grades. We don't see much on test scores, and we've been contemplating quite a bit why that is. And I think we have two potential explanations. One is that student knowledge improves or student engagement improves, but the material taught in class is not really tested in the test, and so there's no effect on the tests. Or the students are actually maybe not changing their behavior so much, but they're assessed differently by the teachers. And there is some indicative evidence that the second explanation seems to play a role. The teachers seem to change their assessment of the student. And then the other interesting result is that we really find negative selection in terms of unobservables, which means that those that have the highest gains are not really taking up the citizenship. And that, I think, gives rise to policy proposals that it would be beneficial to increase the take-up in order to harvest these gains that are not realized yet. And I will stop here, and thank you.
Many thanks, Christina, for a great paper and great presentation. Yeah, we see here clearly that, of course, countries not only vary in their regulations between countries, but also within countries. So we see many changes across time, and sometimes good and some beneficial and sometimes more restrictive. Immigrants have to deal with this, but for us researchers, of course, this opens up opportunities to utilize that variation within countries over time. And I think your paper is a great example of what we can do with that. So we go straight to the next presentation. Let me just say that you're very welcome to post your comments using the Q&A function in Zoom. I see that already a first comment was posted, so please feel free to post your comments there, and we go straight to a presentation by Marie Laboussière of the University of Amsterdam, and yes, previously at the Maastricht University as part of the My Life Status team. Marie, the floor is yours.
Can you see my screen? Okay, perfect. Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. So tonight I'm going to present the third paper of my dissertation, which is entitled Timing of Citizenship Acquisition and Immigrant Children Educational Outcomes, a Family Effects Approach. So first, while looking at the citizenship of second generation children, that is children of immigrants who are born in the countries to which their parents migrated. As you may know, and as also Martin reminded us, in most countries, children of immigrants do not have rights to the citizenship of their country of birth. They instead inherit the citizenship of their parents, which means that they rely on their parents' ability and desire to naturalize if they are to become citizens of their country of birth and residence. And the problem is that without host country citizenship, children of immigrants are deprived of a number of rights and benefits. For example, as minors, they may face various mobility restrictions and forms of legal precariousness. And after the age of majority, they don't have political rights, such as voting rights, and they also cannot access some high-rank positions in the public sector, for example. So this research stems from the intuition that host countries' citizenship may affect the well-being and opportunities of the children of immigrants in host societies, starting with education. It investigates the extent to which citizenship is associated with the educational outcomes of children of immigrants in the Netherlands, a country whose naturalization and citizenship laws are fairly representative of the European landscape. So following the jus sanguinis tradition in Europe, children of immigrants inherit the citizenship of their parents at birth. And in terms of naturalization requirement, the Netherlands is also quite typical. So in a nutshell, the residency requirement is of 5 years, and immigrants have to perform a language and civic integration test to naturalize. Another characteristic that most naturalization candidates have to renounce their previous citizenship. So when analyzing the relationship between citizenship and education, a first question is maybe why citizenship would affect education and how, through which mechanism. So Christina already touched upon those mechanisms, so I will go quickly. There are different channels. One is a direct channel from host country citizenship to educational outcomes through children's increased motivation. So we know that citizenship increases their opportunities in the host society, and especially their labor market, future labor market outcomes. So there are reasons to think that children are more motivated and oriented towards the host society. But there are also indirect effects because the literature on the naturalization of first generation immigrants have shown that naturalization fosters the economic, social, and cultural integration of immigrants, and higher levels of parental resources and family orientation are likely to translate into parental investments with positive spillover effects on children's educational outcomes. So overall, there are reasons to think that citizenship has a positive impact on educational outcomes, and that's actually what we find in previous literature. This has been assessed using various proxies or measures of educational attainment or achievement, such as cognitive skills or track orientation or years of schooling. However, it is prudent not to draw a definite conclusion from this literature, because most of these studies provide suggestive but not causal evidence. And the reason is that parental naturalization is a selective process, which means that the part of the observed relationship between citizenship and education may be spurious. So let me illustrate this with a diagram. So, as I said, in most countries, naturalization is a costly procedure, and this is also the case in the Netherlands. And we know that from the literature that immigrants who naturalize tend to be positively selected for income and for other resources, such as host country specific skills. And the problem is that the parental resources and levels of aspiration that enable host country citizenship acquisition for children are also likely to benefit children's educational outcomes. So in other words, children of immigrants who are Dutch citizens may perform better at school, not because of host country citizenship, but just because their parents have higher resources from the start. So this is a typical case of common cause confounding bias. And because these parental resources and aspirations are partly unobservable, we need to address this unobserved heterogeneity at the family level to make sure that we identify a causal effect. In other words, we need to make sure that we control for the ways naturalized and non-naturalized families differ that are related to the outcome, to their children's educational outcomes. So there are some exceptions in the literature, some studies that were able to better identify a causal effect of citizenship on education. Here I don't include the work of Christina and her co-authors, which I only discovered recently. But this also refers to the German case. So a few German studies who also used the introduction of the partial use solely in 2000 in Germany as a natural experiment. And these studies confirm the idea that the relationship between citizenship and education is not only driven by selection, that there is some independent effects. However, due to the specific legislative context under study, they only look at the effect of birthright citizenship acquisition. And this is problematic to the extent that use solely provisions are the exception rather than the rules. and that in Europe, a substantial share of children of immigrants only acquire host country citizenship after birth. So this begs the question whether the effects of citizenship are similar when it is acquired later and not only at birth. And it also raises the question whether there are timing effects. And based on the literature on immigrant naturalization, we can hypothesize that the earlier children acquire citizenship, the greater the advantage in education. So this is the hypothesis that I would like to explore in this work. Before presenting my analytical approach, I first want to briefly describe the outcome. So I'm focusing on the scores that students obtain at the CITO test, which is a test that students take at the end of primary school. This is a standardized test, so it is not assessed by teachers. And it has quite a lot of weight for their future educational trajectories because this test is used to place students in a given track in secondary education. And although this test aims at measuring cognitive skills, it also indirectly measures host country specific skills and knowledge of immigrant families because not all parents are equally informed about the importance of the test, and they are not all equally equipped to assist their children in the preparation. Then, as I said previously, it is important to account for those unobserved family characteristics that may influence both naturalization propensity and educational outcomes. And the strategy I use in this paper is to exploit variation in age at naturalization between siblings, which enables me to control for the shared family background of siblings. So the time invariant family characteristics that are shared between siblings. And what is also interesting with this strategy is that by design, it enables me to analyze the effects of the timing of naturalization, not only of naturalization, because I'm looking at the effect of age at naturalization, whereas previous literature mostly focuses on whether or not someone has naturalized. So I'm using what is commonly referred to as a family fixed effects design. However, I'm not using standard fixed effects in this paper. I'm using a within-between model, which explicitly models an observed heterogeneity at the family level, contrary to the standard sibling fixed effects model, which parcels out this unobserved heterogeneity. Here I estimate both within family and between family effects, so these two coefficients. And the interest of calculating also the between family effects is that comparing these two coefficients provides an alternative to the Haussmann test, which tests the credibility of the exogeneity assumption in the random effect model. So to put it simply, what we want to compare is whether the effects of age at naturalization between families is similar to the effects of naturalization within families. And if the two effects are very different, then it suggests that naturalized families systematically differ from non-naturalized families in ways that may bias the results. So what we want to see here is not only to estimate the effects, but also to compare whether the within and between effects are substantially different. So that's our analytical approach for the paper. I use register data from Statistics Netherlands, which covers the entire population legally residing in the Netherlands. And I use cohorts of second generation siblings who entered secondary education between 2008 and 2015. Here I have a sample restriction. I only focus on schools who participated in the CITO test. And so if I restrict the sample to students who took the test, then I end up with a sample of about 95,000 students who are clustered in about 70,000 families. Then the main regressor I use is age at naturalization. So I use a discrete variable with different age categories. So age, those who naturalize at age 0 are actually Dutch from birth, meaning that their parents naturalized before their birth. And then there are different age groups. And the last one, age 14 and above. So these are students who are still foreign citizens at the time of the test, and they form the reference category in the analysis. Then in the model, I include various individual, parental and household characteristics, because one of the advantages of the within between model is that I can also include variables that are shared between siblings, such as their parental characteristics. So we start with a random effects model, which is a naive model in the sense that it assumes that there is no unobserved heterogeneity at the family level. And this represents the effect of age at naturalization on the standardized test score at the CITO. So what we can observe is that those who naturalize before the age of 7 have a substantial advantage in terms of test score over those who are still foreign citizens at age 14, an advantage of about 0.1 standard deviation. However, what we can observe is that this advantage decreases when children acquire Dutch citizenship after the age of 7, and that it becomes negligible when they naturalize shortly before or shortly after taking the test. So this suggests that there are timing effects, however, mostly in late childhood. For example, we don't observe strong differences between those who acquire it at birth and those who acquire it as young children. However, as I said, this should be interpreted with caution, because it assumes that there is no unobserved heterogeneity at the family level. So that's why I then move to the analysis of the results with the within-between decomposition. So on the left panel in gray, you have the coefficients that were graphically displayed on the previous graph. And then I analyzed results for the within and the between effects. So if we first look at the within effects, we can see that they are slightly larger in terms of magnitude, but they are also imprecisely estimated, because they are only calculated by comparing siblings within the same family. And then if we look at the between effects, they are more in line with random effects. They are very precisely estimated because they are estimated on the full population. But what is interesting is that although they are slightly smaller, they are still of the same order of magnitude than the within effects. And what is interesting is that if we formally test the equality between the two sets of coefficients, we can never reject the hypothesis that the within and between effects are equal. So it means that there are no substantial differences between the effect of age at naturalization estimated within families by comparing siblings who naturalized at a different date, and by comparing families in which families that differ in age at naturalization. So this means that we don't have strong evidence that the results are biased by unobserved time constant family characteristics. And this also means that there is no strong evidence against using the random effects model. So that's why I do in the rest of the presentation to highlight other findings. What is interesting to see is to compare the effect of citizenship with other predictors, especially other parental characteristics that are known to matter for education, so that to have an idea of what is the effect size and whether it's substantial or not. So if a student naturalizes before the age of 7, the advantage is roughly of 0.1 standard deviation, a bit less. It is interesting to see that in terms of magnitude, it is similar to having at least one parent being a homeowner, which is quite a selective characteristics in the Dutch case, and it's also similar to having to living in a single parent household in terms of absolute value again. What is interesting is also to compare the effect with those of parental education, which is known to be a very important parental characteristics in the Dutch context. And here we can see that the advantage in education is comparable or slightly below that of having a parent that is middle educated versus low educated. However, it's also interesting to see that the effect is much below the effect of having a parent that is highly educated, which means that citizenship has a positive effect. This effect is sizable, but still it's not a panacea compared to, for example, having a highly educated parent in the household. Then I investigate whether the effects of citizenship are uniform between individuals. So I add interaction effects with various parental characteristics. Here I describe interactions with parental education and parental home ownership because I think the results are particularly interesting. So if we look at interaction effects with parental education, we can see that actually the effects of citizenship are mostly concentrated among those whose parents are at most middle educated or lowly educated. For those whose parents have a tertiary education degree, the advantage of those who naturalize is non-existent. Whereas, for example, for those who are lowly educated, citizenship helps to close the gap to the mean. And we observe a similar pattern if we look at home ownership status. For those whose parents are renters, citizenship entirely closes the gap to the average CITO score, whereas for those whose parents are homeowner, we don't find a substantial effect or significant effect of citizenship. So this suggests that citizenship matters, but mostly for those whose parents are at a disadvantage in the housing market or in the labor market because they have a low education level. So if I may summarize these findings, so there is evidence that the relationship between citizenship and education is not only driven by selection, and this is, so I only showed a part of the analysis, but this is something that I can confirm with an additional bounding technique that also takes into account time varying characteristics that that I'm not able to control for in the analytical strategy I just presented. And I observed that those who acquired citizenship before 7 have a substantial advantage in education. This suggests that facilitating an early access to host country citizenship may be an effective policy lever. However, I also show that citizenship mainly matters for those who are at a disadvantaged position or whose parents are at a disadvantaged position in the host society, which suggests that citizenship acts as a compensatory mechanism that mainly matters for those who otherwise lack parental resources. And so, yeah, I'm going to end up here, and I'm happy to discuss additional limitations later. Thank you for your attention.
Excellent. Many thanks, Marie. I'm sure the audience has learned a lot, both from your presentation and from Christina's presentation on understanding the topic, understanding how to go about if we want to research that. And it's very interesting. We see a different case, different kind of data, different empirical strategy, but the conclusions are with some, of course, differences, but are overall in the same direction. Okay, excellent. So we had two great papers, and now we have comments by Thomas So. I asked Thomas to give any thoughts that he had on either the papers. Of course, we're also particularly interested to hear how you look at this from the North American context, where children are citizen as soon as they are born on the territory. But of course, there's a lot of research there, maybe comparable, but you will tell us on the 1.5 generation and yeah, the kind of research that you have done, Thomas. So thanks a lot in advance for sharing your comments.
Thanks for the invitation and for allowing me to comment on these papers. These are, I would say, like really two fantastic papers, extremely careful empirical work that I will confess right up to bat, I'm only very partially qualified to really assess, but I will do my best. So if some of my comments may not be pertinent, you can ever so politely tell me so. That's totally fine. I'm going to give a few general comments, so maybe situating how I think about this, and then on both of the papers, and then just a few specific remarks on each of those papers. I think it's good to keep in mind, right, that from the perspective of a migrant, the big prize is permanent residency, or whatever the equivalent is in your country of destination, right? The green card in the United States, the legal permanent resident card in Canada, right? That's what makes a difference in your quality of life, either by first being admitted to the territory, right? Having the ability to be there and take advantage of the labor market, all these things, or being admitted there legally, right? Having not having to hide from the authorities and live your life in fear. Citizenship, sort of as full membership in the polity, right? And to some extent is, I think it's important to keep in mind, symbolic, right? Compared to that bar, and it's symbolic not only from the point of the migrant, but it's also symbolic actually from the point of the state, right? I mean, I think Rogers Brubaker makes this point very, very nicely in his seminal book. There's really not that much cost of expanding access. The expensive thing, if you will, is admitting people to your territory, right? Then giving them citizenship really is like, you know, there's very little cost to this. Now, of course, you know, as a good sociologist, I know that like just because something is symbolic doesn't mean it's not important. It doesn't matter. I think both of these papers have quite convincingly shown that this, you know, citizenship matters, and citizenship matters for the children of immigrants. So I think that's so the first point I want to make. I think another so more general thought to keep in mind here is that for most people in the world, citizenship is an ascribed status, right? It's something, it's sort of one of those, like, you can think of sort of the last medieval thing we like live with in the world, like this status that you ascribe by birth that you don't earn, and that like has a huge implications on your quality of life, right? The passport you're born with is probably the largest predictor of your quality of life. I mean, people here know all this. For immigrants, though, it's interestingly, it's an achieved status to some extent too, right? And I think you both make this very clear, right? Anybody who's ever gone through the process of, you know, first migrating and getting legal permanent residency and then, you know, naturalizing, you know, the sheer amount of effort and work it takes to navigate these things is mind-boggling, right? So it takes a very particular type of person who can do that. For the children of immigrants, right, the second generation, it's like it's complex, depends, right? For some, it's just an ascribed status, right? It was an achieved status by their parents. It's for them an ascribed status. And in some contexts, yes, there's an additional process. Even in Europe, there's an additional process to undergo. For the 1.5 generation, again, it's more complicated. Still, like the people who, children who were migrants themselves, but came at very young ages, and also in this interesting category that they're certainly in the United States context, right? Like they're socially off the country, but legally or politically not. Of course, given this fact that citizenship is an achieved status in some way, identifying a causal effect of that gets very tricky. I mean, right? And so obviously hats off to both of you for tackling this challenge and doing so in a really quite convincing way. Not only that, you were able to identify that the effect of this is likely to vary, right? That we have the people who are least likely to acquire citizenship are in a way those who would most benefit from it. I think, I mean, again, this is not entirely my area of expertise, but I know so there's similar findings, obviously, from in other cases, right? For college attendance, I think there's famous papers that show that people who are least likely to get admitted to certain colleges are those who would benefit the most in terms of their incomes and quality of life. And I'll try to come back to this parallel and how, to what extent it might work or might not later on, if I have time. So another major question that both of these papers touched on, like, so what's the mechanism? How does this work? Why does citizenship matter? And maybe, at least in my mind, thinking about this as I read the papers and as you presented it again, one can maybe group this into two broad buckets, right? I mean, one is sort of self-perception orientation, right? How people think of themselves as full members of society, how that translates into parenting strategies, how that translates into making claims against the state. For example, I mean, I think the horrific case in the Netherlands about that I read in the papers about people being prosecuted for aid they received or not received is certainly one way of thinking about this. You know, orientation towards the host society, perceptions of permanence, etc. So that's one broad set of mechanisms we can think about creating this link. And the other link is the perceptions by others. How do those around you perceive you? This is what Christina's paper highlighted, right? So do people see you as more permanent or more willing to invest, take a risk on you, et cetera, et cetera. One thing to keep in mind, I think, in this second type of explanation is, right, that citizenship is generally not visible interactionally. Right? Except in very rare circumstances, we don't, in our social lives, don't show our passports, right? It's critical at the border and at some other key interactions, but generally this is not something that's easily there. Now, this can come up and people can learn about this, but it's so something that's may or may not be visible or present in day-to-day interactions. So that, I think, will matter there as well. Before going sort of saying a few words about each of these papers, I maybe want to highlight, there's a lot of agreement here, which is very encouraging, right? That, like, two extremely smart and talented and hardworking people like find these, consistent results, and very, very sort of careful empirical research comes to should give us some confidence that these things are actually true. But nevertheless, I thought it was interesting that there was some differences in the details, or maybe not so details. So in Christina's paper, you found what was conspicuous, the absence of an effect on test scores. As I understand, that's the dependent variable in Marie's paper, right? And you found a very clear and sizable effect. So, I mean, why in the Netherlands, why not in Germany? One could certainly come up with explanations, but that's sort of one discrepancy there. I thought there was also a difference in the detail, somewhat in detail of the findings about the difference between the birthright effect versus sort of the ease of naturalization. Now, you didn't totally address this directly in your paper, Marie, but I thought, as I read the results, at least, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, there was no difference, right? It was like versus between birthright and early naturalization. It was the main difference was between late naturalization and everything else, which is I thought somewhat of a difference to the finding that Christina. So this would be, I mean, I'd be obviously interested in hear both of your thoughts on this, how you would reconcile or not these things. I'll give one other general comment that you feel totally free to ignore this. This is my own hobby horse in this research. So what about how do we think about family level decision-making dynamics, right? That these things, that children may have a say or may not have a say in what parents do, that the influences may go really all sorts of ways when it comes to the decision to apply for citizenship. And how would that complicate or not your identification of these effects, for example? I tried to think this through, but I wasn't able to. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. So let me just give you a few quick comments on these, very technical papers. So they'll be fairly technical comments, and again, they may display a lack of my understanding of some of the very details here. And so, if so, please, I apologize. So the key in both of these, right, because the key challenge here is identifying these effects, right? It's like, because selection looms so large in this research question. And I think both were really great in like putting this advanced and like putting this up front and really going through this. So in Christina's paper, as I understood it, there were a number of identification strategies that hinged on sort of slightly different assumptions. One was the difference between birthright citizenship or not. So that pertains to different migration and / family formation trajectories, right? And so the ignorability of that question, can we compare the people who whose children can claim birthright citizenship and those who can't, compare that? There are observable differences there, I guess, that we can control for, but there may also be unobservable differences, I suppose, right? That might be harder to control, that pertain to motivations for migration and sort of, how family formation plays in the migration life cycle, et cetera, right? That we could, again, I'm playing somewhat devil's advocate here, and this is quite a nitpicky point, but that one could see could also be related to the outcomes that you study there. Now, the other identification strategy was, as I understood it, the eligibility to apply for citizenship, right? Which for those who are not eligible at birth runs by like a certain type of residence in Germany in this case. And of course, right, controlling for one can control for the time in the country, and so once that is controlled for, right, it seems the independence assumption should be satisfied. I guess the one thing I was wondering is that this eligibility is also something that people can expect, right? This is something that people see coming. That like after 8 years you're eligible, and how could that different degree to which people expect this eligibility arising matter? I'm not quite sure if that point is accurate, but so I would like to know if it is or not. Two more smaller points here. As I understand it, right, these instrumental variable strategies, they identify a local average treatment effects in themselves. Now, when you aggregate this up to the average treatment effects and the average treatment effects for the untreated and things of that nature, it seems to me that there's additional assumptions about the comparability that enter the picture. And I guess I was wondering, to what extent are these findings, that the aggregation of these effects, then how can we think about they're robust, or how much they matter, these certain assumptions then matter? And more on a conceptual level, I find it like hard to think about the treatment effect on the untreated in this case. And to come back to this college admissions comparison that I made earlier, right? We can think of, in the case of college admissions, to me, this makes sense, right? It's like, well, if this person had gotten into college they would have earned this and this much more money. And this is a bigger effect than for those who actually got in. In this case, it's a little different though, because these are people who didn't even apply for citizenship, right? Who didn't go through the process. Can we make the same analogy? What does it mean, a treatment effect on the untreated in a case where the lack of treatment was basically a lack of selection into the treatment, rather than a lack of admission into the treatment, because these are not people who were denied citizenship by and large. Right, if you say like, well, Germany is going to adopt like a US style birthright citizenship, which is probably beyond the wildest dreams of even anybody in the current government that's being negotiated. That may be the case, but I guess I was just a little bit puzzled about this final point here. Just a very quick point on Marie's paper. Again, I was really impressed by this, extremely creative use of the data. That I think that bounding approach was, even though I couldn't follow all the exact mathematical details of it, I thought it was quite convincing, and how it gave sort of an additional layer of believability to these results. So on this more narrow identification question, I didn't have only one question. How do we think about sibling effects here? Because it seems like in your fixed effects model, the identification works around the timing of which different siblings get citizenship. But now we know there's all sorts of other ways in which siblings, or the age of siblings, influence educational attainment. So again, I don't know how this would shake out, but to what extent do your results hinge on that, and how worried ought one be about the effect? For example, I think there is burgeoning set of findings that normally we think of sibling effects go, younger siblings are worse off than older siblings. It seems like, from what I read, in migrant families, this may actually be the reverse, right? And we have good reasons for why that might be, because older siblings, they're the test animals in a way. They go through the school system, and by the time, their parents learn a lot about the school system, and then especially those siblings know a lot about the school system and can help the younger kids. So to what extent might these kind of dynamics be important to consider in these estimations? So I mean, again, I think it's a great set of papers. I think incredibly sophisticated, careful empirical work. I'm convinced these effects are there. I mean, I guess it's my job to poke and be critical as where I could, and I had to really, read quite carefully and think hard to come up with something. So those would be my comments, and I look forward to your response.
Thanks a lot, Thomas, for poking, and that's exactly what we asked you for. So yeah, lots of comments, and I would maybe ask Christina and Marie to be selective in answering, and maybe you can take 2 comments along from the chat that were posted earlier, though, because those are questions for clarification. People are free to still post more questions. If you give a quickish answer, then we can do one more round after this. But Bronwyn asked for, on the paper by Christina, just to clarify, I think, on your approach to identifying the causal effect. So does improved education follow take-up of citizenship, or does take-up of citizenship increase with education? I think that's a good thing to clarify. And just for Marie, maybe you could clarify Dortje's question on the CETO score. And as I read Thomas' comments, I think these questions about the differences, that would be the most interesting one, right? Why do we find no test score effect in Germany, but in the Netherlands? Is this an empirical strategy or context, or is there something else going on? And this question of late versus early and naturalization vis-a-vis birthright effect, those I think will be the most interesting to pick up. Thanks.
Yeah, so let me maybe quickly try to answer the chat questions. So does citizenship follow educational investments or vice versa? So what we basically exploit is whether somebody is eligible yeah, at some point for in our period for citizenship or not. Now, you might think, obviously expectation plays a role, and I have papers that show that expectations about future, you know, how long you have to wait, play a crucial role in what type of investments you make, and education should be one of them. But we basically, I think in that sense, you know, if we think about the expectation of being able to naturalize in the future might actually already influence me. In that sense, we would estimate a lower bound, because that would mean that some of the people who are not yet eligible would already invest more or do something. But, you know, so in that sense, I think we are relatively safe. Let me say that most people in our study first get eligible earlier before we actually observe them and observe the outcomes. So, you know, I think that's okay. And then I guess the other chat comment on the teacher assessment, I also wanted to say that I think teachers have probably a sense of what sort of the citizenship status of their students are. And Germany is a case where we know from the literature, and that's also what's discussed in the chat, that immigrant children are much less likely to be promoted to the high school, for example. I mean, it's even conditional on any kind of grade and test scores. It's much, much lower. And it seems like that's sort of pushed in the right direction, that the differential treatment seems to be reduced. So I think that seems to be a mechanism. And then maybe on the differences with the test scores. So one big difference I could see is that the tests that are designed in the survey are not really testing the material in class. They're designed by the survey team, and they might or might not be closely related to what's taught in class, and they're not a condition to proceed to anything. So it's basically a test that, you know, they might think, well, it doesn't matter, and that might explain some of the differences. Marie.
Yeah, that's also what I was thinking, indeed, to explain the differences between our two papers. I think the CITO test, it's a high-stake test, and it's perceived as such, at least by some parents. And it has so much influence on subsequent trajectories, especially in the period that I'm studying in the paper, that I think it may not be very comparable, or at least what I think I measure here with the test score is, of course, children's cognitive ability, but I think I'm also capturing some parental investments, some parental strategies behind it, because, yeah, that's, so I think this may explain why we observe differences. Maybe if I come back to the other questions. So the question about the CITO, so whether there are systematic differences between schools that take part and do not take part to the CITO test. That's a very good question. That's actually difficult to assess, because there is a lack of documentation about the profile of the schools who have the CITO test. There are two main reasons for not having a CITO test. Either schools have a different test providers, or schools don't have a CITO test at all. And this is notably the case for the special primary schools who welcome students with learning gaps and low cognitive ability. So in that sense, these are not students I'm really interested to include in the research population, because I think they are not really comparable to the other students and don't have the same learning opportunities in any case. So I exclude these children from the start. But if I compare, then having removed these students, if I compare the schools with a CITO test and without a CITO test, based on observable socio-demographic characteristics, there are some differences, but they are minor. So in that sense, it doesn't suggest that there are systematic differences in ways that should bias the results. But again, I would be very happy to actually find documentation about this. And maybe I can also reply to the question about the birth order. So that's actually something I include in the model because, as you said, birth order is known as a very important factor to explain different outcomes between siblings. And actually what I do observe is a positive effect of birth order, which is also kind of contrary to what I would have expected for the children of immigrants. But there's still to be a similar effect as in so-called native populations.
Thanks. Maybe there's one more general comment on the discussion on birthright citizenship in the, I guess, the North American context. So maybe if Thomas has any thoughts on this, we'll come back to you on this. Maybe just a question to Christina that I had on the summary statistics, Christina. So actually 84% of your sample is citizen, right? At the moment that they are surveyed. And yeah, I wondered to what extent you are worried about that. Does this say something about the selectivity of the survey, or is this actually a relatively representative idea of the citizenship status of the children of immigrants at sort of the average age in your survey, which I suppose is adolescents maybe? And maybe a related question to this. So can you tie this to this question that Thomas posed on the difference between the two papers, right? So Marie doesn't really find a birthright effect, but rather an effect of early naturalization. And to what extent is that something that you can, that you of course try to identify this by using these instruments for the cohort and the age. But of course, at the time that they are born, this may be to some extent averaged out in the sense that they have citizenship, but it's less precise about how they acquired it, right? So to what extent, yeah, is that, are those sample characteristics relating to maybe a difference between the two studies?
Yeah, so let's talk quickly about the sample. So in the average population, the take-up is much lower. We're about 40–45%. It is, however, higher among younger immigrants and children of immigrants, and that's because of birthright citizenship, because that's not, that's bestowed on you once you're born and your parents satisfy the requirements. So in that sense, I think the sample is not too unusual, I would say. And yeah, I was thinking about the difference that Marie finds and my results between birthright and naturalization. And I can think of two mechanisms why birthright and naturalization have different results for children of immigrants. One is birthright is way early on, right? And that's what Marie seems to suggest. If you're sort of within this period before the magic age of 11, which seems to be a sensitive period for lots of things, including language acquirement, for example, you seem to be okay. The other big thing, which I think plays a bigger role in maybe in my case, because my sample is probably also older, is who makes the decision. And my sense is also in terms of when we see which groups are sort of taking up the citizenship, that the Turkish are much less likely, for example, it seems like the parents, if parents make the decision, they have probably maybe also different things in mind. The educational performance of their children, I'm sure, plays a role, but there are other cost elements. You have to give up your other citizenship. There may be something where you're like, I don't feel German. So I think there are trade-offs that are completely different from birthright citizenship, which also I think explain why the margin is less sensitive, let's say, than if you give it by birthright.
Yeah, I was thinking that another difference between our studies is that, so in Germany, even birthright citizenship is conditioned on a legal residence of 8 years, whereas it's much shorter in the Netherlands. So in that sense, it also influences the kind of effect we are estimating. Because if we rely on the literature on immigrant naturalization, there is evidence that the shorter immigrants naturalize, the greater their citizenship advantage. And in that sense, maybe that in Germany, so when immigrant parents acquire German citizenship after 8 years, the marginal advantage is a bit smaller than in the Netherlands when it's only after 5 years. So I don't know exactly how it can affect the results, but I guess we are not exactly measuring the same thing. I don't know what you think, Christina, about that.
Yes, sorry, let me just jump in here since we have a couple of minutes. I just wanted to state a question that Angela Popik asks, which is about how both of your studies relate to qualitative research. And that's, of course, to some extent an unfair question. So you both do quantitative studies, but there is indeed a lot of qualitative research. And much of the research, of course, is also about the difference between migrant children versus natives, right? And I think what's actually the strength about your papers that you look at immigrant children or the children of immigrants, right? Because this comparison between migrant children and natives can be, even more apples and pears, perhaps. So, what we can take from that question of Angela is to what extent, do your findings say something? Do they speak to qualitative research? And she brings up an interesting idea from the qualitative research that some research also proves that migrant children can perform better at school than native children because they have to overcome some of these challenges that they face. So, do you have any thoughts on this? And before I give you the floor, I also wanted to ask Thomas at the end and to say something, if you want, about, there's one anonymous comment about the birthright discussion in the US. I'm not sure if we can make any conclusive statements about this. There has been some talk, of course, about restricting the current unrestricted jus soli regime. Where this goes, I'm not sure if you have any thoughts about this, and whether you, maybe I would phrase this question more generally. So to what extent do you think that the results from the Netherlands and Germany, do they speak to the North American context? So just some final thoughts on this, but maybe Christina, do you have any final reflections?
Yeah, so I mean, I think our study seems to show that the indicators where teachers play a role are most effective. So the grades, the recommendation for high school. So, you know, my sense is, I think that's totally in line with the qualitative research I've seen. So one would hope, and that's what I think our study would suggest, if that's true, then yeah, having citizenship early on would help, because we would kind of get rid of this issue. And in terms of identity and self-positioning, I don't really have good evidence on that. I mean, we know from some studies that it seems to affect also parental attitudes. So I would think if there's a strong intergenerational mechanism, it would also affect the children. But, you know, that's tentative.
Thanks, Christina. Marie?
Yeah, so I think it also depends on the age of children, because if we look at the qualitative literature on the citizenship of second generation youth, there is evidence that not all of them are aware of their citizenship status. Some of them may only discover the limitations that come with their foreign nationality when they reach early adulthood, for example. So in my case, I'm looking at children who are around the age of 12. It seems a little bit difficult to assume that already from that age, they have a strong feeling about what is their citizenship and what it implies. So in that sense, I would be a bit cautious to attribute the effects to at least only self-positioning.
Thanks. Thomas, any final thoughts?
On the question of birthright citizenship in North America, I mean, I think one could limit this to the United States safely. I think Canada is in no danger of abolishing birthright citizenship. I don't think the US is actually either. I mean, there's many reasons to be pessimistic about the political path in the United States, but I think I'm not an expert on law, but it seems like it's in the Constitution. It'd be very hard to imagine this changing. If it were to change, I think it would be you know, it would be pretty bad. It would be a catastrophe, right? I think it would really change things. I'm not sure if sort of, you know, not to, I mean, it would be bad for the children of immigrants. It would be bad for educational attainment. It would change the politics of the country in a profound way. And I think those effects would probably be what I would be most worried about, right? That you have a large number of people who won't be able to vote and won't be able to, you know, shape policy, including educational policy, in the way it should be, right? And their interests would not be reflected. But it would also create a huge class of people who would feel not included and would change their horizons and lead to these kinds of effects that these papers have shown. So.
Thanks, Thomas. No, this is both papers are definitely, in that sense, a cautionary tale of the importance of citizenship and something that should be cherished in the North American context. Well, we reached the end of the session. Thanks a lot to Christine and Marie for presenting your work. Good luck, both of you, with further working on your papers and publishing your work. Everyone else in the audience, do keep an eye on Global Cit on our website. We always we announce recently published studies. So if you want to keep up with a really, you know, rich and ever growing literature on citizenship, visit our website once in a while and follow us on social media. And that you will definitely see the announcements of the publications of the papers by Christina and by Marie. Thanks a lot also, Thomas, for sharing your thoughts. I really enjoyed the discussion. And if you want to revisit our discussion, we will post this video of the webinar online on Global Cit, where you can also find the previous webinars on diversity of topics, diaspora governance, statelessness, citizenship deprivation. So visit globalcit.eu. And everyone in the audience, thank you for joining us. Thanks to the presenters and the discussant. And I wish everyone a good evening or rest of the day. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.